What exactly determines whether a job is hard to play? It is indeed a lot of things, and some things affect some players more than others, and sometimes what content you do can also matter in regards to which job is the hardest. Now, to help me answer the question of which healer is the hardest, I sent out a poll to ask all of you. A lot of you did vote, and while there were some smaller surprises, the spread was close to what I anticipated. Now, you may have already peeked at the video length or even the chapters and noticed that multiple jobs are up for debate, and indeed, we will be talking about what could make each job feel difficult, ranging between many different skill levels, all the way from casual to hardcore optimization trying to squeeze every single point of damage possible. We will be talking about the jobs in order from easiest to hardest as well. Also, some of you might be saying, what's the point? Dawn Trail is coming real soon anyway. And the point is exactly to see if these jobs become easier with Dawn Trail. And with that, let's get started. For each job, we'll be talking about the difficulty in the leveling experience, the difficulty in a more casual setting where, at most, you might typically try to optimize around your own cooldowns, and the difficulty in a coordinated raid group setting where we try to see how much you can optimize and how hard that would be when coordinating with the entire team. For the easiest job, with very few votes, we have White Mage, which is a rather deceptive job in many aspects. For a large percentage of players, White Mage is the first healer they try, which of course makes it feel more familiar than any of the other healers. On top of this, White Mage is the one among the healers that is the closest to just a healer with no nonsense. Most of its tools just heal a lot, which again makes it very approachable. However, the rather focused kit of the White Mage also gives rise to some things that makes the job a bit difficult when you take a closer look. For the leveling experience, White Mage is by far the slowest of the four healers to get some healing OGCD options for when things suddenly go south. White Mage also has the most expensive healing spells among the four, and takes the longest to properly get their MP management tools online, with Aflato's Misery being the final way the job can save MP with a free attack about every minute, learned at level 74. Further, Holy being the only attack among all healers with a full 2.5 second cast time makes it more complicated to use efficiently. Coupled with the stun also means you may need to be more thoughtful with when you start using it. All of this means that while the White Mage's toolkit is rather straightforward, in the majority of the leveling experience, White Mage can feel inferior to the other healers due to being slow to gain a specific property, or simply being a bit more stiff due to being more GCD-centric among the healers. It isn't uncommon to hear that supposedly White Mage is so easy that simply maintaining Medica 2 on the group is enough, which is not entirely true, but does speak volumes as to how strong White Mage's healing options are perceived to be. In a more casual setting at max level, what typically signifies optimizing a healer is making sure you're attacking as much as you possibly can while making use of any damage increasing options you might have, which in turn means making the most of all of your healing OGCDs. This of course also applies to White Mage, where in a dungeon setting, the presence of Holy causes a major part of making the most of White Mage's damage to be about playing chicken with the tank's HP bar. The longer you can spam Holy uninterrupted, the more damage you can push out before you have to stop. Add in things like Presence of Mind, Asai's and Aflato's Misery while spending healing lilies between pulls, and White Mage can be quite an impressive damage dealer in their own right. As a result of White Mage benefiting from this kind of risky playstyle on large pulls, there's a huge difference in playstyles between White Mages, heavily dictated by how much risk each player dares take, ranging from those that start healing once the tank takes damage at all. These do exist among all four healer jobs, but are typically weirdly a lot more common among White Mages, all the way to those that don't do anything in regards to healing until the tank will actually die if nothing is done. Once we move on to boss fights, White Mage becomes easier. Since most of the toolkit is simply healing, White Mage is often content with responding to damage after the fact, so boss knowledge is less crucial. And if you lean on spending lilies for healing when they're available, there's very little resource management to worry about beyond using the damage dealing buttons like Air Size and Presence of Mind when they are available. White Mage having such an overwhelming capacity to heal a lot also means you will rarely ever be found wanting in terms of raw healing output, which can be comforting for less experienced healers. It is also worth mentioning that while White Mage has the greatest capacity to spend MP among the healers, Thin Air coupled with its other MP saving options also makes it by far the greatest at saving MP. In a coordinated raid context, healers are generally much more likely to plan their healing cooldowns ahead of time if possible, and in such a situation, a White Mage can to some degree simply plan their lily usages ahead of time, which can naturally lead to a Flatus Misery coordinating with raid buff burst windows. Presence of Mind being a damage buff for the White Mage also gives them an easy way to keep track of when the burst is coming up every 2 minutes. In a way, this means that in a coordinated group, this can make White Mage feel more stiff because your best movement options, like the lilies, can be stuck in a specific scheduled window, meaning you may need to be better at planning your movement beforehand. For the second easiest healer, perhaps shockingly for a lot of players, is Sage. For many, the two things that make Sage the hardest is a combination of the job starting at level 70, giving them way too many things to learn all at once, and the fact that so many of the buttons look similar. It's all so blue, and this isn't helped by the majority of their actions legitimately being in Greek. Like, that's not even a turn of phrase, it is actually Greek, which makes it very hard to memorize if you don't know what an action even means, or even how to pronounce it. Despite this, Sage is often viewed as Scholar, but easier, which is partly caused by having no pet to manage, and Sage's cooldowns often being fully functional each individually, where Scholar's buttons combo together for a larger whole. I know it is a bit unfair to start by comparing Sage to Scholar like this, but the jobs have so many overlaps in their toolkits that it would almost be ignorant to not compare them like this. For the Sage leveling experience, as stated, the job starts at level 70, which can make it very overwhelming right out the gate. Understanding how to use Cardia beyond "put it on the tank and forget it exists" can be difficult. Sage being a barrier healer, and so having less readily available burst healing than something like a White Mage, and a more strict resource system, also means that being on top of the healing all the time is more important. Because of how, counterintuitively, the barrier healers are the ones that worry about maintaining the tank all the time. Not the pure healers, or at least not in the same extent. This is even further complicated by the fact that while Sage's tools all individually are very effective naturally, they often don't quite have the power to do something entirely on their own. So learning to maintain 2 cooldowns at once rather than just 1 can be part of the learning experience, not to mention learning which things to combine. There's also the very strange part that Sage gets their most amazingly helpful cooldown upgrade at level 78, meaning you would need to get by for 7 levels without it. It isn't quite a warrior's raw intuition, but adding a healing component to Keraholi is absolutely amazing. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who feels that there is Sage before level 78 and Sage after level 78 in terms of healing. Naturally, most of these factors are mainly problems in large AoE pools, which are a major part of the leveling experience. In a boss fight, similar concerns can crop up. For example, if someone takes a lot more damage than expected, using everything you have to top them up right now can mess up a barrier healer much more than a pure healer. In a more casual context at max level, offensively, Sages don't have much to worry about, since they have no personal damage buff. Make sure you have Toxicons for when you want or need to move. Flemmer can also be used for this, as long as you don't sit on 2. Aside from that, just maintain the dot and use doses. Defensively, Sages can often spreadsheet entire dungeon pools for cooldowns, making the hard part knowing when to use what, and what is enough. In a boss fight, as Sage is a barrier healer, the performance of the job is often a lot more down to knowing when you need a cooldown before it happens, since barriers and damage reduction don't do much once the damage has already been done. Options like Pepsis and Nebma do offer outs when you are late, but compared to, say, a white mage that could resort to something like Cure 3 if it is really necessary, the recovery period is a lot more sparse for a barrier heal like Sage. In a coordinated raid, just like for white mage, it is reasonably common to expect that healer cooldowns are planned out, which means that the Sage can have a strong idea of exactly how many Toxicons they will have available at any given time for movement. And in regards to movement, optimally, 2 out of every 3 Flemmers in a 2-minute time frame might be used during raid buffs, which also greatly reduces the amount of buttons you may have available to run around with. In a more casual setting, it is a lot more common to simply throw out an Youth Creation Prognosis if you have to reposition and Toxicon isn't available. But if you are trying to maximize your performance, this would only happen with a scheduled Youth Creation Prognosis. This does mean that similar to White Mage, you may get forced to look a lot further ahead on where you need to be. For a raid burst window, it is also possible that Toxicons may be useful for sneaking in an extra attack before raid buffs end, which means even Toxicons can be lost to maximizing damage at times. Now, for the second hardest healer, slightly higher up in votes, we have the other barrier healer, Scholar. Mildly similar to Sage, Scholar also has the issue of starting at level 30 instead of 1. The fact that Scholar is also a pet job doesn't do it any favors in terms of difficulty either. Furthermore, Scholar, while having slightly less MP usage than White Mage, has the worst MP recovery of the 4 healers, making it harder to make use of spell healing aggressively when things do go wrong. Finally, Scholar has a lot more weird actions compared to Sage, not to mention some tools that simply don't work if not used correctly. To name a few comparisons where Sage wins in ease, Keracholi is a fire and forget where Sacred Soil needs to be placed, although it is huge. Where Sage can throw out a shield and then decide to turn it into healing with Pepsis, Scholar has to preemptively decide to use emergency tactics. Ritsumata just gives you one Adder Skull to use on whatever, where Scholar's recitation, while improving the thing you do spend it on, is rather specific on what you can spend it on, and when. And finally, where Sage can use tools like Holos and Panheimer for extra party shields, Scholar has to set up Adloquium first to get anything out of deployment tactics. An extra detail is also that where Sage has the option to use Prognosis for just raw healing, not that you really would want to most of the time, Scholar only has Succor, which is situated somewhere between Prognosis and Youth Creation Prognosis in functionality. Now, for the leveling experience, Scholar does have the insane advantage that for a huge portion of the leveling, Eos is so strong that a decent tank often won't need much else than maybe an Adloquium for the run, and then Eos handles the rest. The downside to this is that this can also quickly sneak up on an unsuspecting Scholar, as when Eos is no longer able to carry the load on their own, the Scholar might not be well acquainted with what does and what doesn't work. Add to this Scholar's more fine control of resources compared to Sage, where you have to decide whether you need the healing or to sacrifice it for damage, and you have to decide whenever you want more ether flow. This also leads to this situation where when trying to do well in a dungeon, Scholar is often incentivized to emphasize specific cooldowns, pet cooldowns, over ether flow. Similar to Sage, however, at level 78, Sacred Soil turns into one of the most amazing single cooldowns in the game. In a casual max level setting, Scholar is one of the raid buff providers with Chain Stratagem, which would mean that coordinating with yourself is partly like coordinating with everyone else. Optimizing as a Scholar, though, is heavily about knowing how much ether flow you need and knowing it early, so you can use energy drains during raid buffs, or at least Chain Stratagem. Similarly, knowing when you do or don't need Eos, so you can use Dissipation as aggressively as possible. In a way, optimizing a Scholar's performance is a lot about knowing what you don't need and sacrificing it. This even includes Ruin 2, since Broil will always do more damage. Scholar also has a lot of similarities to Sage in that, as you are more limited in actual healing capacity, knowing a fight beforehand is much more important, so you can intercept the damage before it is dealt. Oh, there's also the slight nuance that in a casual setting, as you cannot predict your raid teams, getting paired up with a Sage can sometimes make all your shields feel absurdly pointless, as a Sage can, intentionally or not, override any of them with a Youth Creation Prognosis. In a coordinated raid team, as previously mentioned, cooldowns are often coordinated beforehand, which, when done well, can mean that you already know exactly how many ether flows you have left over at any given time before the fight even starts. In a way, this places Scholar in a position where what they can optimize casually is so close to what they can optimize in a raid team that it is simply more about being more aggressive with these ideas of sacrificing resources when coordinated. Which leads us to the hardest healer in Endwalker, with over 60% of the votes being Astrologian. This is often a combination of things. The card system forces you to maintain this completely unrelated resource while also healing the group. While Astrologian has a lot of cooldowns, many of them accomplish similar goals to the other healers in extremely roundabout ways. The planning nature of many of the cooldowns also mean that you may need to know things more ahead of time for the healing to land at a relevant time. Finally, the random nature of the job also simply adds a part to the job the 3 other healers don't even have. For a large part of the leveling experience for Astrologian, it can feel like White Mage, but better. Except you also have these cards to manage. Simply because Astrologian can accomplish exactly the same as White Mage, but for less MP, and it has cooldowns sooner. But then there's also the card management, and a raid buff. This can often place Astrologian in a position where, rather than being locked up like White Mage spamming Holy, you instead just need to juggle so many things at once that the tank might wilt before you remember to heal them at all. Drawing the cards in time, deciding whether you want to play them or redraw, and also choosing the right target to play them on in quick succession. This particular aspect also makes Astrologian even harder than other healers for a lot of players and controllers. But once we get past the card playing part, Astrologian can feel like a weird combination between Sage, Scholar and White Mage. In that, it often wants to greed on healing similar to a White Mage, its cooldowns combined together in a greater whole similar to Sage, and many of the cooldowns feel absurdly weird to use like Scholar. In a way, this means Astrologian combines some of the more difficult aspects of all of the other healers, and then adds randomness on top. And doing well in a dungeon poll often comes down to knowing when to use what, before things happen. Simply because some of the cooldowns take time to take effect. For a casual setting at max level, Astrologian can feel a lot easier than initially expected, simply because there's much less of a need to play all your cards in quick succession. If you can't expect others to burst well anyway, then just playing cards is good enough a lot of the time. This doesn't change the fact that Astrologian both has to deal with the weirder functionalities of its defensive cooldowns, but also manage the cards. I don't think there's much to add there beyond that. And finally, for the raid coordinated Astrologian, card bursts become relevant, playing 3 cards in the raid burst and 1 card on the odd minute. Each card has to be played in relatively short order, so you have very little time to think of whether you want that card, and if you do, who to give it to, and if you don't, redraw and who to give that to. Doing all of this optimally can be extremely intense, even more so on a controller of course, and due to the amount of players to choose between, knowing who to give what to can be a challenge in and of itself. A patch buff to specific DPS? Maybe that's the one that has first priority on melee cards now. So not only does Astrologian effectively present itself as the highest actions per minute healer, but it also has the most data to keep track of, and often the least time to process it. So, before we round up, there are a few factors that I do recognize also play into a ranking of difficulty of jobs. Naturally, players that main a given job typically find that job a lot easier to play, meaning, for example, that people that never played Sage might be inclined to say Sage is hard. Similarly, Astrologian mains would be less likely to say that Astrologian was hardest. Another factor is that in a poll like this, some people might just vote on whatever they believe is hardest, and Astrologian is widely known to be insanely difficult, which can further inflate their numbers. And finally, such a poll also gathers results from all skill levels, from new players to veterans, from hyper-casuals to hardcore savage raiders. Anyone could have voted. However, I do feel that the jobs did get ranked in a way that makes sense with the things we know would make a job difficult. So, to summarize, White Mage tends to have their difficulty from their stiffness, and in dungeons from the wackiness of their AoE, making them play very weirdly compared to other healers. Sages get a lot of their difficulty from simply being difficult to understand at first. and starting at very high levels, but is by many who have tried it viewed as easier Scholar. Case in point, many of the things that make Scholar difficult are similar to Sage, but add on the pet management and rather strict tools, not to mention the option to sacrifice defensive options for more damage. And finally, Astrologian gets most, if not nearly all of its difficulty from the whole card management stuff. Yes, the healing tools are also weird, but the cards take such a large part of the cake that I'm extremely curious to see how Astrologian ranks compared to the other healers come Dawntrail, in terms of difficulty. I admit that I probably may have forgotten details or maybe have even skipped quietly over something important in my analysis in this video, so if you have anything to add about the difficulty or ease of any of the jobs, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, Aflata's Misery used to be worth around 3 glares in damage, which actually made it a DPS loss. This also meant that using lilies at all was considered a DPS loss, which in turn meant White Mage was considered to have by far the worst MP management. In 6.1, Aflata's Misery was buffed to be worth 4 glares, which both made it no longer a DPS loss, but indirectly fixed most of these MP issues by making using lilies a good proposition rather than a bad one.